All right, here we have 1.4 circular flow and economic systems, kind of wrapping up unit 1 here. So today's goals, what we want to look at is to be able to define a market and define the different types of markets, specifically the two that we're going to look at, the factor market and the resource market. We're also going to be able to illustrate and explain the circular flow model, which is another one of these models we're going to take a look at here in unit 1. We're going to be able to compare and contrast command systems or command economies with laissez-faire economics or laissez-faire capitalism, the economic system. And then finally, we're going to describe elements of a market system, specifically the market system that we see existing within the United States and our economy. So, to get us going as we start to look at this model of the circular flow, I want to introduce a few quick ideas. The first is just this idea of a market. You guys have probably heard of markets before, whether it's the stock market or the farmer's market or different types of markets. Well, what is a market? It's just a place wherever buyers and sellers are interacting. So at the farmer's market, right, farmers come, they act as the sellers, they're selling their produce, they're selling their goods, and the buyers come and they interact there. Same thing with the stock market. It's the buyers and sellers of shares of stock. Now, we're going to talk about two specific types of markets that you and I might interact within on a daily basis. And those two are, first of all, the product market. And the product market is just a market, as the name kind of says, where products are bought and sold or goods and services are being bought and sold. So you guys are pretty familiar with this. Anytime you go to the store, you're participating in the product market, right? You are purchasing, whether it's food, clothing, whatever it might be, goods and services are being bought and sold. You're typically acting as the buyer within the product market. We also have the factor or the resource market. And again, as the name demonstrates, the factor market or the resource market is where the factors of production are being bought and sold. And you participate in this one every single time you go to work. For example, when you go to work, you are acting as labor, right? That is the resource that you are. And therefore, as you go to work, what you do is you enter into an agreement with your employer. Your employer is acting as the buyer of your labor, and you're acting the seller. You say, hey, I will sell you an hour of my labor for $10. And so you are participating in the factor market because you are selling your labor, which is a factor of production, and your employer is acting as the purchaser or the buyer of that. Now, we understand like what that payment for that labor is. Like we understand that to be our income or our wages, but I want to talk about what these payments for the other factors are. And so we have capital, which the payment for that is just what we call interest. Entrepreneurship, the payment is profit, right? Like that business mind, the risk taking, the payoff for that is profit. Land, we call that rent. It's not the same kind of rent you think of like if you're renting an apartment. That's actually something that's called economic rent. But a lot of us are familiar with the payment for labor, which is just our wages, right? The amount that you get paid for going to work and selling your labor at work. But this is all going to tie in with something we refer to as the circular flow of economic activity. So let's go ahead and take a look at the circular flow and see how this works, and we'll see how that circular part comes into it. Within our economy, we see two major players. We have firms and businesses, obviously, and then we have you and me, individuals or households, however you want to look at it. And we interact with each other on these two different markets that we just discussed, both the product market and the factor market. The one that we're probably most familiar with is the product market because that's the one that we understand maybe the easiest or that we see happen the most. Now, within the product market, we had said on the previous page that products or goods and services are being bought and sold. Now, we have to understand the role of each of these groups, whether firms and businesses or individuals and households within the product market. Now, we as individuals, we don't produce products. We are the ones buying the products. Firms and businesses are producing the products or the goods and services. And so we see there's a flow through the product market of firms and businesses providing goods and services to individuals and households. Now, you and I, we receive those goods and services. That's why that arrow is pointing toward the individuals and households. But again, we don't just get those for free. So in the other direction, we have the goods and services going from the firms and businesses to the individuals in the product market, but we have a money flow that's happening as well within the product market. Now, whenever we receive goods and services, that money that we give up is referred to as consumer spending, right? It's the money that we use or we spend to buy goods and services. Businesses don't view this money as consumer spending. They instead view this money as their business income, right? The money that we as individuals spend on goods and services, those businesses receive as their income. So that's the product market. It's really kind of this simple idea. We're just saying that, hey, in most situations, when you go to the store, you as an individual, you receive goods and services and you spend money in exchange for that, right? The businesses are the one providing those goods and services. They're receiving their income by selling those. And that's what the product market is saying. We also have the factor or the resource market though. And this one sometimes can be a little bit more difficult for people to understand, but hopefully after seeing this you'll catch on pretty quickly. Now in the factor market or the resource market, we say that the factors of production are being bought and sold, or resources. In a market economy like the United States sees, these resources or these factors of production are actually owned by the individuals. They're owned by the people, right? And so therefore, if firms and businesses want those resources or need to attain those resources to make stuff, they have to receive those factors of production from the individuals. They have to buy those factors of production from the individuals within the factor market. I think the easiest one for us to understand with this is labor. We had just had this discussion just a minute ago, but you and I, whenever we go to work, we are acting as the sellers of our labor or the sellers of the factor of production. We're participating in the factor market. Again, you're not going to just show up to work though for free and just show up. You expect payment in return. Now, that money that flows from firms and businesses to individuals in exchange for those factors, it's viewed, it is money, but it's viewed in two different ways. Businesses view this money as their production costs, right? Any money that they have to pay, whether it's for the natural resources or capital or for labor, they view that as the cost that goes into their production. But we view that as our personal income, right? When you go to work and you sell your labor or whatever it might be, you make money. That's your personal income. But now, why is this a circular flow? Well, if we put these two sides together, you notice that we do have a circular flow, and we actually have two flows going in opposite directions. First and foremost, we have the clockwise flow of goods and services and factors of production. And again, just to put that simply, in the product market, individuals receive goods and services. We use those goods and services to live our daily life so that we can then go to work and provide those factors of production to firms and businesses. Firms and businesses receive those factors of production. They piece those resources together into goods and services so that they can then sell them to us, the individuals and households. And we see this cycle would just continue on and on. That's that circular flow. But then we have the money flowing in the other direction, right? So from individuals, we have consumer spending that happens within the product market. Businesses receive that money as their income. They take that money and they use it to buy more resources. And they buy those resources again to make goods and services. Now, as they buy those resources, that payment or that purchasing of those resources is their production costs. And that production cost comes to individuals as their personal income, which they then take their personal income and use to buy more goods and services. And so we see that flow going in the opposite direction on that inner flow. Again, as you're working through this, my big concern is not that you memorize this. You can actually go through this and work through this without having to memorize it. I want you guys to more understand the flows and specifically understanding the role that the firms and businesses or the individuals play within a specific market. Now, another way we might be able to look at like this is just through this little quick chart or table. And this is a way I like to think about it to help me better understand the roles. So let's see, individuals and households, what is their role within the product market? Well, they serve as the buyer of goods and services. In the same way within that product market, firms and businesses act as the sellers of goods and services. And so therefore, within the product market, we have a buyer, we have a seller, and that's why it's a market, because they're interacting. And we see, like, again, when you go to the store and you're buying stuff, you, the individual, is acting as the buyer in that product market, and the business or the store wherever you're at is acting as the seller. In the factor market, we see that individuals or households, they sell those factors of production, therefore they're acting as the sellers in the factor market. And again, they're selling the factors of production, whether it might be your labor or it might be your entrepreneurial skills, whether it's your capital that you have or land, any of those things it could be. And the firms and businesses, they buy those factors of production. They buy those resources so they can then piece them together to turn into more goods and services, to turn around and sell and make their income, right? So again, circular flow, guys, don't try to memorize that whole entire chart. I care more that you can understand the roles of each of these. And by understanding the roles, then you can piece it together and illustrate that chart. But we talk about all these decisions that have to be made, and that brings us kind of back to this idea that we had talked about at the end of lesson 1.1, that all economies, when they make decisions about these resources, they have to ask themselves three different questions, right? It's what are we going to produce, how are we going to produce it, and for whom are we going to produce it? And that brings us to this final point of 1.4 and this whole entire unit, and that's just economic systems. And really, economic systems, we look at those three questions, but really when we look at those three questions, we want to understand what is the government's control or the government's role in answering those questions. So if we have this line here, this kind of this spectrum, we'll say here on the left side we have just a total government control within the economy. On the right side we have no government control within the economy. Now, a total government control, we actually refer to that as what we might say a command economy. A command economy is whenever the government decides what is produced, how it's produced, and for whom it's produced. So those three questions, the government is the one making those decisions. You maybe have sometimes referred to that as socialism or communism in its absolute purest form. Now, the government then is the one who owns those factors of production, and that's why they're able to make those decisions of, hey, with these factors of production, what are we making, how are we making it, and who's getting it. Another way we might think of it is that the decisions are being made for the people and not necessarily by the people. Now, if we're going to go to the complete other end of the spectrum, we have no government control, which we refer to sometimes as laissez-faire capitalism. Or what we might say is that the buyers and sellers in this market are the ones who are deciding what, how, and for whom the country is producing. So this is when there's absolutely no government control. We sometimes refer to this as pure capitalism. So the people, not the government, are the ones who own the factors of production. And instead, the government solely exists to protect people's private property. Another way we might say this is that the decisions are being made by the people instead of being made for the people. Now, again, these are the two total, one end or the other, and they both have their pros and cons. A command system, some of the advantages of that is the central planning makes it easier to reallocate and mobilize resources. We saw this in the Soviet Union when they switched from more of an agriculturally based economy to an industrial based economy. We also see that it promotes equality because it's attempting to redistribute income or redistribute resources and make sure everybody's getting what they need. Laissez-faire capitalism, on the other side, encourages more freedom because people have choice, and therefore, if you have choice, there's more consumer satisfaction. At the same time, we see with private ownership of these resources, people have private property, and this economy adjusts gradually over time. As we maybe see things go in style or out of style, or as we see the buyers and sellers making these decisions within the markets, we see this, this ebb and flow over time, and the economy can adjust to trends that we see. But again, both of them have disadvantages as well. Command systems, because there's a central planning, it oftentimes limits the amount of choice or freedom that people might have. And also because the central planning is deciding who's getting what, there's not always incentives to achieve higher if there's no real reason or that you're not going to get any more out of it. Laissez-faire capitalism, on the other side, has its disadvantages as well because we see it creates inequality. We hear about these big gaps between the rich of the rich and the poor of the poor. And at the same time, we don't always see that there's enough goods and services of certain ones that are being produced because there's no incentive for private business to do that. For creating a public park or for creating roads or police services or fire services, all of those types of things. We see wouldn't exist in an absolute pure system because there's no incentive for private business to do that. Now we see the United States actually fall somewhere in the middle. Now it's not exactly in the middle, but they fall somewhere in the middle because they have a little bit of both, right? And we refer to this as a market system. A market system, or you might also call it a mixed market system, or just capitalism without the pure. So we say that buyers and sellers make the decisions for the most part, and we see that because, we make decisions. We can choose where we're buying, what we're buying, all those types of things. But for the U.S., the government does play a pretty big role. They set rules for economic activity. We can see that through antitrust laws, preventing monopolies, or through even, the FDA as they set regulations for food. The government also exists to promote growth and stability. We saw a lot of this after the Great Recession just 10 years ago and how the government got involved in order to make sure that the economy was recovering properly. They provide goods and services that might not otherwise be produced. The government provides things like education. You get to go to high school for free, and if the government didn't do that, all schools that would exist would be private and would cost you thousands of dollars a year to go to. Also, like we said, roads and police and all those types of things exist because since the private market wouldn't do anything about it, the government steps in to fill that role. And they also help to redistribute income, and we see that through things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. So a few other characteristics you might see, again, is that private property we had talked about within laissez-faire. We see competition. Competition encourages growth, and we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide as well. Freedom of choice, we get to see that you get to make decisions in your choice. Markets get to interact freely, and therefore they help set prices. We see that there's specialization, and through specialization, we're able to be more efficient as an economy. And we do see that the government is involved, like they're active, but it's a limited government. And so in the United States economy, we see just a little bit more specifically, what are some characteristics we see within the U.S.? Well, we see economic freedom. Again, you get to make choices for yourself. And tying in with that, there's voluntary exchange. Buyers and sellers are able to interact freely within the economy. Private property also exists. People, us, we control our own possessions, whether that's the things we actually own or the factors of production. There's also profit motive. There's always an encouragement for people to improve or do better because there is money that can be made and they can improve their wealth. And then finally, competition, as we had mentioned before. Competition leads to better products. As competitors compete against one another, they're trying to be better than the other. And so they will always want to be the next best or have the next biggest thing. We also see that competition leads to lower prices, which is beneficial for the economy as a whole.